Jean LeBell had broken arms for a living, choked out champions, survived things that would have ended most men before breakfast. In 40 years of combat sports, nobody, not one single person, had ever made him feel what he felt the afternoon he trained with Bruce Lee. He described it only once, in full detail, in a private conversation that was never meant to be recorded. And what he said about those 3 hours in a gym in Culver City will change the way you think about fear, about power, and about what a human being is actually capable of. This is that story. The man who feared nothing and meant it. You need to understand who Jean LeBell was before a single word of this story makes sense. Because if you don't understand Jean LeBell, you will read what happened between him and Bruce Lee and think it is exaggerated, that it is legend inflating itself the way legends always do, that the numbers got rounded up somewhere between the gym and the telling. They didn't, and the reason they didn't starts with the man himself. Jean LeBell was born into combat. His mother ran a boxing promotion. He grew up ringside. He was training seriously before most kids his age had decided what sport they liked. By his 20s, he was a national judo champion, not just competitive, dominant. The kind of dominant that makes other champions quietly relieved when they don't have to face you. He then did something almost no serious martial artist did in that era. He crossed over. He studied wrestling, judo, sambo, boxing. He absorbed every system he could find and turned himself into something that had no clean category, a fighter who could operate at every range, in every position, under every set of rules or none at all. Hollywood found him. Of course it did. A man who could make violence look real because it was real. That was exactly what the stunt world needed. He became the most respected stunt coordinator in the film business. He trained actors, coordinated fights, threw himself off things that would have hospitalized anyone without his specific combination of skill and stubbornness. Along the way, he fought professionally. He choked out a professional boxer in a real contest at a time when that simply was not supposed to be possible. He trained killers. He trained champions. He was not a man who used the word fear casually. When Jean LeBell said he finally understood fear, the people who knew him went very quiet. How two worlds collided. They moved in overlapping circles for years before they actually trained together. Hollywood in the late 1960s and early 1970s was a small world inside a big industry. The stunt community especially. Everyone knew everyone. Reputations traveled fast and arrived accurate. You couldn't hide what you actually were when the people around you had spent their careers reading bodies and assessing threat and making split-second judgments about who was real and who was performing realness. Jean LeBell had heard about Bruce Lee the way everyone in that world had heard about Bruce Lee. The demonstrations, the speed that cameras struggled to capture, the one-inch punch, the stories from people who had worked with him on the Green Hornet and came away with a specific look in their eyes that was hard to describe but impossible to miss. LeBell was not particularly impressed by stories. He had seen too many great reputations collapse when they met actual resistance. He had watched celebrated martial artists fall apart under pressure that was even slightly more real than what they trained for. He believed, fundamentally and from long experience, that the only honest measure of a fighter was what happened when someone was genuinely trying to hurt them. He respected Bruce Lee. Of course he did. You didn't survive in that world without respecting real ability when you encountered it. But he wanted to know, the way only another serious fighter wants to know. Not the demonstration version, the real version. He got his chance in the spring of 1971. A mutual contact arranged it, a training session, a gym in Culver City, just the two of them and two other people who have never been publicly named. LeBell arrived first, set up, waited. Bruce Lee walked in and Jean LeBell's first thought, by his own admission, was, he's smaller than I expected. That thought lasted approximately 4 minutes. The first 4 minutes, false safety. They started slowly, the way real fighters always start, carefully gathering information, letting the situation breathe before committing to anything. Bruce Lee moved beautifully. LeBell acknowledged this immediately and without reservation. The fluidity, the precision, the economy of motion that told you every movement had been refined to its essential minimum. But LeBell was a grappler, and grapplers think differently than strikers. While the striking world watched Bruce Lee's hands and feet and marveled, LeBell was watching something else. He was watching the hips, the weight distribution, The moments between movements when a man's balance was momentarily committed and therefore momentarily available. He was mapping Bruce Lee the way he mapped every opponent, looking for the entry point, the angle, the specific geometry that would close the distance and bring the fight to the ground where LeBell had ended so many encounters that looked unwinnable from the outside. He found what he thought was the angle. He moved, and Bruce Lee was not there. Not in the way people describe it when they mean someone was fast, in a more specific and more unsettling way, as if he had known the move was coming before LeBell's body had committed to it, as if he had read the intention in the microsecond before the execution and had simply stepped out of the geometry LeBell had been building. LeBell reset, recalculated, tried again from a different angle, same result. He stood back, looked at Bruce Lee, really looked at him for the first time since the session started, and something cold and precise moved through Gene LeBell's chest that he would spend years finding the right word for. If you love Bruce Lee stories, subscribe. I post rare stories every day. What LeBell saw that changed everything. In 40 years of combat, Gene LeBell had developed a specific ability, the ability to read a man's limit, the ceiling of what they could do, the moment where their training ended and their improvisation began to fail them. Every fighter had one. The best ones had it very high, but it was always there, always findable if you were patient enough and skilled enough and honest enough with yourself about what you were actually seeing versus what you expected to see. He had found Muhammad Ali's ceiling. He had found the ceiling of Olympic judo champions and professional wrestlers and trained killers from 3 continents. He could not find Bruce Lee's. That was the thing. That was the specific thing that produced the cold feeling in his chest. Not that Bruce Lee was beating him. He had been beaten before by people who were better than him at a specific thing on a specific day. That was just fighting. This was different. This was the absence of a ceiling. The feeling of reaching for the edge of someone's ability and finding that the edge simply was not there. That the space continued further than it was supposed to. Further than LeBell's own considerable experience had taught him a human being could actually go. He said later, in that private conversation that was never supposed to be recorded, that the closest he could come to describing it was this. It was like trying to grab water, not because he was slippery or evasive in the normal sense, but because he seemed to exist in the moment of your intention, not the moment of your action. By the time you were doing the thing, he was already in the next moment. He was always one moment ahead, not 1 second, one moment, and that gap was uncrossable. The moment LeBell stopped being the hunter, and something shifted. LeBell was used to being the hunter. Even in the hardest sessions, even against the toughest opponents, he operated from that position. The one who was pressing, the one who was building towards something, the active agent in the situation. He realized somewhere around the 60-minute mark that he had not been the hunter for some time. He couldn't point to the exact moment it had changed. That was the unsettling part. There was no single move that had announced the transition. It had simply happened, gradually, invisibly, the way a tide comes in, not through a dramatic event, but through the accumulation of small moments, until suddenly you are much further from shore than you planned to be. Bruce Lee had not taken control of the session aggressively. He had not dominated through force or speed or any single overwhelming quality. He had just, over the course of an hour, made LeBell's choices for him, made each move available or unavailable through a process so subtle that LeBell had been participating in his own redirection without knowing it. The word that came to LeBell later was chess, but not the kind of chess you play with someone at equal level. The kind of chess you play against someone who has already seen the end of the game and is simply walking you toward it with patience and precision and complete confidence. He stopped, stepped back, put his hands up in the universal signal that he needed a moment. He stood there breathing, looking at Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee looked back, completely still, not winded, not triumphant, just present, waiting, with the particular quality of someone for whom this specific intensity was simply normal Tuesday afternoon. LeBell said, "How long have you been doing this?" Bruce Lee said, "Doing what?" LeBell waved his hand at the space between them, the whole session, the thing that had just happened. Bruce Lee thought for a moment, then said, "I stopped doing it when I started being it. I don't remember when that was. LeBell was quiet for a long time after that. The second hour, when the real lesson began. After the break, they kept going, but something had changed in the texture of the session. LeBell had stopped trying to find the ceiling. He had accepted, for the first time in as long as he could remember, that the ceiling was not findable today. Possibly not findable ever. And in accepting that, he had released something. Some tension that he hadn't known he was carrying into every session of his life. The release of the need to win made him, paradoxically, better. He moved differently in the second hour, less calculated, less mapped, more responsive, more present. Bruce Lee noticed immediately. He said, "There, that. What just changed?" LeBell had to think about it, then said, "I stopped trying to beat you." Bruce Lee nodded, said, "And now we can actually train." The second hour was different from the first in every way that matters. Not a hunt, not a test. Two people in genuine exchange, each one's skill calling something out of the other that neither would have reached alone. LeBell said it was the best training session of his life, not because he had won anything, not because he had dominated anything, but because for 1 hour he had been completely and entirely inside what he was doing, with no part of him standing outside it, managing and calculating and comparing. Bruce Lee had made him forget to perform. And what was underneath the performance was the best version of LeBell that LeBell had ever accessed. That is what Bruce Lee did to people. Not just fighters, everyone. He made you forget to perform yourself. And what was underneath was always better. If you love Bruce Lee stories, subscribe. I post rare stories every day. The third hour, and the thing about fear. Near the end of the session, they sat down, drank water, talked. LeBell asked about fear. He had spent decades studying it, his own, other people's. How it arrived in the body, how it changed movement, how the best fighters managed it, and the merely good ones were managed by it. He told Bruce Lee that he had never truly been afraid of another fighter. Concerned, yes. Cautious, respectful of danger, but not afraid. Not in the way he had been afraid as a child before he understood what his body was capable of. He asked Bruce Lee if he was ever afraid. Bruce Lee was quiet for a long moment, long enough that LeBell thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Every time." LeBell stared at him. Bruce Lee said, "The fear doesn't go away. You don't train it out of yourself. You train yourself to act from the same place the fear comes from. The fear and the response come from the same source. When you stop separating them, the fear becomes the fuel instead of the obstacle." LeBell said nothing for a while. Then he said very quietly, "In 40 years, nobody has ever said that to me. And I think it's the truest thing anyone has ever said about fighting." He paused. About anything. The climax, what LeBell said walking out. The session ended 3 hours after it began. They shook hands, said they would do it again, meant it completely. LeBell walked to his car alone. One of the two unnamed witnesses caught up with him in the parking lot, asked him how it was. LeBell stopped walking, stood with his keys in his hand for a long moment. Then he said something that the witness has repeated word for word every time the story has come up in the 50 years since. He said, "You know what I finally understand after today? Fear. I finally understand what fear actually is." The witness asked what he meant. LeBell had just said inside that he never truly felt fear. LeBell nodded, said, "Exactly. I never felt it because I never let anything be bigger than me. I always made myself the biggest thing in the room. I've been doing that my whole life." He looked back at the gym. That man in there is the first person I've met who is bigger than the room without trying to be. He doesn't make himself big. He just is. And standing next to that, I finally felt it, what it actually is. He got in his car, started the engine, said through the open window, "It wasn't frightening. That's what surprised me. It was the most peaceful thing I've ever felt." Then he drove away. The moral hit, the truth LeBell found. Here is what LeBell spent 40 years doing without realizing it. He made himself the biggest thing in every room, not through arrogance, through mastery, through the genuine and hard-won ability to handle more than almost anyone else could handle. He built himself into something that left no room for fear because there was no room for anything to be bigger. That strategy worked. It worked extraordinarily well. It built a legendary career and a body of achievement that few people in the history of combat sports can match. But it had a cost he didn't see until that afternoon. It kept him from ever standing fully in the presence of something greater. It kept him slightly outside every moment because he was always also managing his position within it, always slightly the observer as well as the participant. Bruce Lee was not bigger than LeBell because he had made himself bigger. He was bigger because he had stopped trying to control the size of the room. He was just there, fully, without management, without the small, constant effort of maintaining a position. And when LeBell stopped making himself the biggest thing and just stood in that presence, he felt fear for the first time and discovered that fear was not what he had spent 40 years avoiding. It was the feeling of something mattering completely. It was being entirely present with no escape route. It was, as he said, the most peaceful thing he had ever felt.